There is a moment in the life of every international system when a warning stops sounding like a prediction and starts looking like an explanation. For years, a small number of analysts argued that the world was entering a period of growing instability. They pointed to rising geopolitical competition, increasing economic fragmentation, mounting security concerns, and the gradual erosion of the assumptions that had defined the post-Cold War era. At the time, many of those warnings seemed exaggerated. Global markets were functioning, trade was expanding, international institutions remained intact. Most people assumed that whatever tensions existed could be managed within the existing system. Today, that assumption looks far less certain. A major crisis has emerged, and it has captured the attention of governments, businesses, investors, and ordinary citizens across the world. Headlines are filled with discussions about economic disruption, strategic competition, political uncertainty, and the possibility of further escalation. Every day brings new developments, new reactions, and new predictions. Yet despite the enormous attention being paid to the crisis itself, there is a growing argument that most observers are focused on the wrong question. The question dominating public discussion is simple. How bad will this crisis become? But the deeper question is far more important. What if the crisis is not the real story? What if the event dominating the headlines is merely the visible manifestation of a much larger transformation that has been unfolding beneath the surface for years? This distinction matters because history is full of moments when societies misidentified the true significance of major events. People often focus on the trigger because it is visible. They focus on the immediate shock because it is dramatic. They focus on the headlines because headlines are easy to understand. What they frequently miss are the structural forces that made those events possible in the first place. That is why predictions about crises are often misunderstood. The most accurate forecasts are rarely predictions about specific events. They are usually observations about underlying conditions. Analysts rarely know exactly when a system will experience stress. They rarely know what specific incident will trigger a disruption. What they can often identify are the vulnerabilities accumulating beneath the surface. And that is precisely what makes the current situation so significant. Many observers are treating recent developments as if they appeared suddenly. In reality, the warning signs have been visible for years. Strategic rivalries have been intensifying. Economic dependencies have been turning into vulnerabilities. Supply chains once optimized for efficiency have become sources of geopolitical risk. Nations that once prioritized integration have increasingly begun prioritizing resilience. Governments that once focused primarily on economic growth have started placing greater emphasis on security, autonomy, and strategic leverage. None of these trends emerged overnight. They developed gradually, often unnoticed by the broader public. Each trend seemed manageable when viewed in isolation. Each appeared to be a separate issue with its own explanation. But when multiple pressures begin converging at the same time, the strategic reality changes. What once looked like isolated challenges start to resemble a systemic shift. This is where many interpretations become incomplete. The common narrative suggests that the crisis is causing change, but another interpretation is gaining traction among geopolitical analysts. According to this view, the change was already happening. The crisis simply accelerated it. Instead of creating a new reality, the crisis exposed an existing one. That may sound like a subtle distinction, but its implications are enormous. If the crisis itself is the primary problem, then the solution is relatively straightforward. Governments manage the disruption, stabilize conditions, and eventually return to normal. The existing system remains intact. The crisis becomes a temporary interruption. But if the crisis is merely a symptom of deeper structural pressures, then stabilization becomes much more complicated. Solving the immediate problem does not eliminate the forces that produced it. Even if the headlines disappear, the underlying dynamics remain. The vulnerabilities remain. The strategic competition remains. The incentive structures remain. And that means the future may look very different from the past. What makes this particularly important is that the consequences extend far beyond governments and policymakers. Geopolitical transformations are often discussed as if they only affect diplomats, military planners, and political leaders. In reality, systemic shifts eventually affect everyone. They influence energy prices, investment flows, supply chains, employment opportunities, technological development, inflation, national security priorities, and the overall direction of economic growth. When international systems change, ordinary life changes with them. That is why understanding the deeper story matters. The headlines tell us what is happening today. The structural forces tell us what may happen tomorrow. And when we look beyond the immediate crisis, a more significant possibility begins to emerge. The event attracting global attention may not represent the breakdown of the existing order. It may represent something even more consequential, the beginning of its transformation. Many people assume they're watching a crisis unfold. The more important possibility is that they're watching a transition unfold. The difference between those two interpretations may ultimately determine how we understand everything that follows. Because to understand where this is heading, we first need to understand the system that made it possible. To understand why the current crisis has become so disruptive, we need to look beyond the event itself and examine the environment in which it emerged. Crises rarely appear out of nowhere. They usually develop within systems that have been accumulating stress for years. The visible shock captures public attention, but the deeper story is often found in the structural pressures that existed long before anyone recognized them as a problem. One of the most important realities of the modern international system is that its greatest strengths gradually became sources of vulnerability. For decades, globalization was built around a relatively simple assumption. Efficiency creates prosperity. Governments, corporations, and investors organize their decisions around this principle. Supply chains stretched across continents. Manufacturing concentrated in regions offering the lowest cost. Energy systems were optimized for affordability. Technology networks expanded across borders. Financial systems became increasingly interconnected. The results were impressive. Global trade expanded, economic growth accelerated, consumers gained access to cheaper products, businesses achieved unprecedented levels of efficiency. The world became more connected than at any previous point in history. But there was a hidden trade-off. The more interconnected the system became, the more dependent it became on stability. Efficiency often came at the expense of resilience. Redundancy was viewed as waste. Strategic reserves were seen as unnecessary expenses. Diversification frequently lost out to optimization. As long as the environment remained stable, these choices appeared rational. The problem emerged when stability could no longer be taken for granted. A supply chain designed for maximum efficiency can become remarkably fragile when geopolitical tensions rise. A manufacturing network spread across multiple countries works well until political disputes begin interfering with economic relationships. An energy system dependent on predictable flows functions effectively until those flows become instruments of strategic leverage. What once looked like strengths suddenly begin to resemble vulnerabilities. This helps explain why recent disruptions have appeared so severe. The issue is not simply that individual systems failed. The issue is that many systems were designed around assumptions that no longer reflect geopolitical reality. And supply chains are only part of the story. The deeper issue is that the global economy increasingly depends on resources that have become strategically important. Energy, rare earth minerals, semiconductors, critical technologies, industrial metals, and advanced manufacturing capabilities are no longer viewed solely as economic assets. They are increasingly viewed as instruments of national power. This shift has profound implications. In previous decades, many governments assumed that economic interdependence would reduce geopolitical tensions. The logic was straightforward. Countries deeply integrated through trade would have strong incentives to avoid confrontation. Economic cooperation would encourage political stability. That assumption now faces growing skepticism. Many strategists argue that interdependence did not eliminate competition. It merely changed its form. Instead of competing primarily through military means, states increasingly compete through supply chains, technology access, financial influence, industrial capacity, and control over strategic resources. Economic relationships that once appeared mutually beneficial can suddenly become sources of leverage. As a result, governments have begun reevaluating dependencies that previously seemed harmless. A nation dependent on foreign energy supplies may worry about future disruptions. A country reliant on imported technology may fear strategic vulnerability. A government dependent on external manufacturing capacity may question whether it can maintain resilience during periods of instability. This is one reason why energy has returned to the center of geopolitical strategy. For much of the globalization era, energy was often treated primarily as an economic issue. Prices mattered, markets mattered, efficiency mattered. Today, energy security increasingly matters just as much. Control over energy production, transportation routes, infrastructure, and critical resources create strategic leverage. Nations capable of securing reliable access gain flexibility. Nations dependent on vulnerable supply routes face greater constraints. What makes this particularly important is that energy competition intersects with nearly every major geopolitical challenge. Industrial production depends on it. Military capability depends on it. Economic growth depends on it. Technological development depends on it. In many ways, energy remains the foundation beneath the global economy. But energy is no longer the only strategic battleground. Technology has become equally significant. A growing view among geopolitical analysts is that technological leadership may shape the balance of power in the 21st century as profoundly as industrial capacity shaped the balance of power in the 20th. This is why competition surrounding advanced technologies has intensified so dramatically. Artificial intelligence, semiconductor manufacturing, telecommunications infrastructure, cyber capabilities, quantum computing, and advanced industrial systems are increasingly viewed through a national security lens rather than a purely commercial one. The strategic logic is clear. Countries that control critical technologies gain economic advantages. They gain military advantages. They gain influence over future standards, networks, and systems. They gain leverage over competitors. As a result, technological cooperation increasingly coexists with technological rivalry. What appears to be a commercial competition often contains a deeper strategic dimension. And this technological rivalry feeds into another structural pressure that has been building quietly for years: declining trust between major powers. Trust is one of the least discussed elements of international stability, yet it is one of the most important. Complex systems depend on expectations. Governments make decisions based on assumptions about how other governments are likely to behave. Businesses invest based on expectations of stability. Markets function because participants believe existing rules will remain relatively predictable. When trust declines, uncertainty rises. When uncertainty rises, risk calculations change. When risk calculations change, behavior changes. This creates a powerful feedback loop. Governments become more cautious. Alliances become more important. Strategic hedging increases. Economic diversification accelerates. Security concerns gain greater influence over policy decisions. And this is where the hidden reality beneath the crisis becomes most visible. Many of the trends shaping today's environment are not isolated developments. They reinforce one another. Technological rivalry increases distrust. Distrust encourages economic diversification. Diversification weakens existing interdependencies. Weaker interdependencies reduce incentives for cooperation. Reduced cooperation increases geopolitical competition. Greater competition encourages further security measures. Each trend amplifies the others. The result is a system experiencing multiple forms of structural pressure simultaneously. What makes this especially significant is that these pressures were developing gradually for years. There was no single dramatic moment that clearly signaled a transformation. Instead, countless small changes accumulated beneath the surface. Because each individual change appeared manageable, the broader pattern remained difficult to see. This helps explain why many policymakers underestimated the scale of the challenge. Political systems are often designed to respond to immediate problems rather than long-term trends. Leaders face election cycles, budget constraints, domestic priorities, and short-term pressures. Structural shifts unfold slowly. Their consequences often emerge years after the underlying causes begin developing. By the time those consequences become visible, many of the assumptions that shaped earlier decisions have already become outdated. The warning signs were present: growing strategic competition, rising concerns about economic dependency, increasing pressure on global supply chains, expanding technological rivalry, declining trust among major powers. Viewed individually, each trend seemed manageable. Viewed together, they reveal something much larger. They reveal a world gradually moving away from an era defined primarily by efficiency and toward an era increasingly defined by resilience, security, and strategic autonomy. And once that shift begins, the implications extend far beyond any single crisis, because structures alone do not determine outcomes. What ultimately matters is how governments, institutions, corporations, and major powers respond to those pressures. And that is where the story becomes even more consequential. Understanding structural pressures is important, but structural pressures alone do not determine outcomes. Systems create constraints, opportunities, and risks. Yet it is ultimately human decision makers who choose how to respond. This is where many analyses become incomplete. They explain what is happening, but fail to explain why governments, alliances, corporations, and institutions are behaving the way they are. To understand the trajectory of the current crisis, we need to look beyond public statements and political rhetoric. We need to examine incentives. One of the most consistent realities in geopolitics is that nations respond to incentive structures far more than they respond to slogans. Public narratives matter, political messaging matters, ideology matters. But when leaders face strategic choices, they're usually responding to perceived risks, constraints, vulnerabilities, and opportunities. This distinction is critical because governments often justify decisions using one language while making those decisions for entirely different reasons. A policy may be presented as an economic initiative while actually serving a security objective. A diplomatic agreement may be described as cooperation while functioning as strategic positioning. A military deployment may be framed as deterrence while simultaneously expanding influence. The visible explanation is not always false, but it is often incomplete. The hidden logic is usually found in incentives. This becomes especially important during periods of uncertainty. When systems appear stable, economic efficiency tends to dominate decision-making. Governments prioritize growth, businesses prioritize profitability, institutions prioritize optimization. The assumption is that future conditions will remain broadly predictable. But when uncertainty increases, priorities begin to shift. Security concerns gradually move to the center of decision-making. What makes this transition so important is that security operates according to a different logic than economics. Economic systems reward efficiency. Security systems reward resilience. Economic thinking encourages specialization. Security thinking encourages redundancy. Economic logic favors interdependence. Security logic often favors autonomy. For decades, the global system leaned heavily toward economic logic. Governments accepted dependencies because the benefits appeared greater than the risks. Critical industries became concentrated in specific regions. Supply chains stretched across continents. Strategic resources were sourced from wherever costs were lowest. That model worked remarkably well under stable conditions. The challenge emerged when leaders began questioning whether stability itself could still be assumed. Once that question enters the strategic calculus, behavior changes dramatically. A country may willingly accept higher costs to reduce dependence on external suppliers. Governments may subsidize domestic industries despite economic inefficiencies. Strategic reserves may expand. Critical manufacturing capabilities may be relocated. Alternative supply chains may be developed even when they are less profitable. From a purely economic perspective, these decisions can appear irrational. From a security perspective, they often appear entirely rational. This is one reason why some observers struggle to interpret current developments. They continue evaluating decisions through an economic lens, while policymakers increasingly evaluate them through a security lens. And security concerns rarely remain confined to traditional military issues. Modern security includes technology, energy, finance, infrastructure, industrial capacity, data, telecommunications, and access to critical resources. The strategic battlefield has expanded. As a result, governments are increasingly making decisions that prioritize resilience over efficiency. This trend becomes even clearer when we consider another powerful incentive influencing political leaders: survival. Political survival is one of the most underestimated forces in international affairs. Leaders may disagree on ideology, strategy, or national priorities, but nearly all political systems share one characteristic. Decision makers seek to maintain legitimacy, stability, and control. This creates incentives that are often invisible to outside observers. A government facing economic uncertainty may adopt policies designed to preserve domestic stability, even if those policies create international friction. Leaders may prioritize short-term resilience over long-term efficiency, because immediate political risks are easier to understand than distant economic consequences. This does not necessarily reflect poor decision-making. It reflects the realities of political incentives. The same logic applies to alliances. Many people assume alliances exist primarily because countries share values or political systems. While these factors can be important, alliances often persist because they provide security benefits. States rarely operate in a vacuum. They exist within regional balances of power. They face potential threats. They confront uncertainties about future intentions. Alliances reduce risk by distributing burdens and increasing deterrence. As strategic competition intensifies, alliances often become more important rather than less. This is because uncertainty itself creates demand for cooperation. Governments may not know exactly what future challenges they will face, but they know that facing those challenges alone could be significantly more costly. This incentive structure explains why alliance networks frequently expand during periods of geopolitical stress. But alliances are only one part of the equation. Great powers pursue a broader objective that shapes much of their behavior: strategic leverage. Leverage is one of the most valuable assets in international politics because it creates options. A nation with leverage can influence outcomes without necessarily using force. It can shape negotiations, alter incentives, and increase its freedom of action. Leverage can come from military capability. It can come from economic influence. It can come from technological leadership. It can come from control over resources, infrastructure, financial systems, or geographic positions. The specific source matters less than the underlying objective. States seek leverage because leverage reduces vulnerability, and reducing vulnerability has become a dominant strategic goal. This brings us to one of the most important dynamics shaping the current environment: the relationship between dependence and power. During the era of deep globalization, economic interdependence was often viewed as a stabilizing force. The assumption was that mutual dependence created mutual benefits. There is truth in that argument, but there is another side to the equation. Dependence also creates exposure. The more a country relies on external systems for critical needs, the greater the potential vulnerability if those systems become disrupted. What appears beneficial during cooperation can become dangerous during competition. This realization has transformed strategic thinking in many capitals around the world. Governments increasingly examine supply chains not only for efficiency, but for vulnerability. They evaluate technological ecosystems not only for innovation, but for resilience. They assess financial relationships not only for growth potential, but for strategic risk. This shift helps explain why actions that initially appear aggressive, costly, or counterproductive may actually reflect a broader effort to reduce future exposure. Most analysts recognize these trends, but there's another variable that often receives less attention than it deserves. The overlooked factor is time. Geopolitical analysis frequently focuses on current events, current policies, and current tensions. Yet major powers often think in much longer time horizons. Many strategic decisions are not designed to solve today's problems. They're designed to prepare for tomorrow's environment. This distinction changes everything. If leaders believe the future will be more uncertain, more competitive, and less predictable than the recent past, then many current actions begin to make sense. Investments in domestic manufacturing become preparation. Technological restrictions become preparation. Supply chain diversification becomes preparation. Energy security initiatives become preparation. Alliance strengthening becomes preparation. Strategic stockpiling becomes preparation. What appears reactive may actually be anticipatory. And this is where the deeper pattern begins to emerge. Across multiple regions, across different political systems, and across diverse institutions, a remarkably similar shift is taking place. Governments are increasingly behaving as though the future will be defined by greater competition, higher uncertainty, and increased strategic fragmentation. Whether that assessment ultimately proves correct is almost secondary. What matters is that influential decision makers appear to believe it. And when enough major actors begin operating according to the same assumptions, their behavior starts reshaping the system itself. The consequence is profound. The world is no longer being organized primarily around the pursuit of maximum efficiency. It is increasingly being organized around the pursuit of resilience, flexibility, and strategic autonomy. Once these incentives are understood, a much larger transformation becomes visible. Once we step back from individual events and begin connecting the patterns, a different picture starts to emerge. The crisis, the supply chain disruptions, the technological competition, the shifting alliances, the growing emphasis on security, and the search for strategic autonomy all appear to be separate developments. Yet when viewed together, they begin to resemble something much larger than a series of isolated events. They begin to resemble a systemic transformation. This is the point where many analyses stop too early. They identify instability and conclude that the system is weakening. They observe disruptions and conclude that institutions are failing. They see rising tensions and assume the international order is breaking apart. That interpretation is understandable, but it may also be incomplete. One of the most important lessons from history is that collapse and adaptation often look remarkably similar while they are happening. From inside a period of transition, it is extremely difficult to distinguish between a system that is disintegrating and a system that is reorganizing itself. The symptoms can appear almost identical. Existing arrangements become less effective. Long-standing assumptions stop working. Institutions struggle to respond to new realities. Political disagreements intensify. Economic relationships shift. Strategic priorities change. To observers living through the process, it can feel like disorder. Yet in many cases, what appears to be disorder is actually a period of restructuring. This possibility matters because it changes how we interpret current events. If the international system is collapsing, then the dominant story is decline. If the international system is adapting, then the dominant story is transformation. The distinction is significant because transformation implies that new structures are emerging even as old structures lose influence. And there are growing signs that this may be exactly what is happening. Consider the institutions that have shaped global affairs for decades. Many commentators describe them as weakened, ineffective, or increasingly irrelevant. In some cases, there is evidence supporting those criticisms. Institutions often struggle when confronted with challenges they were not originally designed to address. But weakness does not necessarily mean disappearance. In reality, many institutions appear to be adjusting to a new strategic environment rather than vanishing from it. Throughout history, institutions have rarely remained static. They evolve because the conditions around them evolve. As power balances change, economic relationships shift, and technological capabilities expand, institutions either adapt or become marginalized. What we may be witnessing today is not the disappearance of institutional influence, but the beginning of institutional reconfiguration. The same pattern can be observed within the global economy. For years, discussions about economic globalization focused on expansion. The primary objective was integration. The assumption was that greater connectivity would generate greater prosperity. That logic produced enormous benefits. Yet, as strategic competition intensified, governments began recognizing that interconnected systems also create exposure. As a result, economic systems are being redesigned. This does not necessarily mean globalization is ending. A more accurate interpretation may be that globalization is changing form. If this crisis was only the opening move, what will the world look like when the restructuring is complete, and are we already much closer to that future than anyone realizes?